The rhetoric over legislation to get projects in the so-called national interest off the ground is heating up. One First Nations leader is promising a long, hot summer if the federal government passes Bill C-5. That's our topic on this week's Truth in Politics panel. Jennifer Leywitz is the CEO of Pasqua Strategies, and Egon Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Jennifer and Egon, thanks for being with us. Jennifer, lots going on with Bill C-5 as the Liberal government looks poised to pass this legislation no matter what. What do you expect the reaction from First Nations to be?
Well, I think we're already seeing that the reaction is not positive. I think, this is a really interesting start to the new government out of Carney. I'm seeing a lot of nations that are obviously upset, lack of consultation, and how quickly it's being rammed through, and only having access to the full text of the legislation a week prior to it being moved through Parliament. I think post it passing, we're also going to see nations very upset, but how quickly we'll see that be diffused is still up in the air. But I think there's also nations out there right now that maybe don't understand fully the implications maybe of this, because there hasn't been enough time to fully go through what this legislation is, what impacts this might have, and even for nations to speak to their legal teams or their elders or knowledge keepers about the long-term effects of legislation like this. So I think it's even hard right now for nations to even publicly comment or respond in a super meaningful way when they're still even trying to figure out what does this fully mean for us.
Egon, it's a double whammy for First Nations in Ontario who are also dealing with Doug Ford's Bill 5, which is passed. Alvin Fiddler, the Grand Chief of Anishinaabe Nation, which represents 49 First Nations, saying if this federal legislation is passed, it will be, quote, a long, hot summer, saying First Nations will not sit idly by. Should the federal and Ford governments take it seriously?
Well, Doug Ford only followed the tone set by Mark Carney. And Mark Carney was the one who came in who said we need to get these projects done quickly, efficiently, as within 2 years we have to pass this new bill by Canada Day. And Doug Ford simply just jumped the gun, said, I'm going to get my own bill done, and followed the lead. And of course, he'd been trying to do that for quite a long time, but he knew he had the political capital to be able to do it because he was following the tone of the Prime Minister. What you're hearing here is a sigh of here we go again. And it's the same old cycle over and over and over again, where Canada has grandiose plans, implements those plans in some way or another, either through a bill or through a private consultation or proposing a project of the national interest. And then suddenly, a First Nation says, hey, slow down a minute, or what does this mean for us? Or we got our people, we got to look at it. And then you're deemed as not being in the national interest, that you're somehow the enemy to the economic agenda of the country. First Nations are not the enemy. The First Nations are your best partners. Métis communities, Inuit communities are your number one champions. There's nobody that comes to the table more to want this country to be successful than First Nations, Inuit, Métis governments. And yet they're constantly put in these positions of being ostracized, marginalized, and then treated as the oppositional to these bills simply because they want to be involved. They want to be at the table, and they want to be included in the consultation for this. And I wrote about this week, I see a lot of conflict coming. And that conflict that's coming is people are organizing, and most importantly, people are not going to tolerate bills that will be, or projects that will be hammered down their throats. And those things that, how much do we pay you, is just not a formula that's going to work. It's how much do we include you, which has just not been a part of the conversation, including this bill.
The National Chief spoke to the Senate about the bill, but Jennifer, some First Nations, in particular Mikisew Cree First Nation, Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation, have called out the AFN and the National Chief over this. Can you enlighten us on what that's about?
Yeah, I saw a letter, actually. It's been circulating all over social media, but I think it actually came out a couple weeks ago. Chief Sheldon Sunshine and the chief of the other nation had basically explicitly said that the AFN actually doesn't speak on behalf of all nations. And kind of the end of the letter sounded almost like a warning, like this is the last time we're going to remind you of this. I think it is incredibly important for people to remember that the AFN is not a government. They are not the rights holders. They are a lobbying and political organization, and they're operating essentially like a corporation or an organization would. The issue is that the government, I think, just tries to bypass the complexity of nations and what it looks like to deal with different types of nations across the country. And I think they like to go directly to the AFN and say, well, we negotiated on this or we negotiated on this. Things are great. The issue is that we're almost seeing like one political head at the top of this organization trying to apply one size fits all solutions and getting involved in the drafting of legislation and even the negotiations around child welfare. But this is somebody that is not representative of the rights holders on a direct nation. And it's getting really tricky because at the end of the day, the AFN has had a really hard time separating themselves politically from the government. There's been people saying they don't know where the AFN ends and the government starts. Our AFN national chief, the hard truth is that she has been politically involved in the past with the Liberal Party, having been the former president of their Indigenous Liberal Association. It is very difficult for people to trust you fully and to not hold you and your feet to the fire when you have been politically involved with the same government that is now attempting to pass this legislation that is trampling over rights. And I think the government also has a duty to remember that the AFN, again, are not the rights holders. And you cannot just bypass what a nation wants out of consultation protocols, what they map out as their traditional territories, and go straight to the AFN and say, well, we're good. We did what we needed to do. But there's also some form of responsibility placed on the AFN as well to recognize their role and respect the nations and their leadership. Our leadership on our nation should not have to come out publicly like that with a letter that threatening saying, like, back off, we've had enough. But that's exactly what happened.
Niigaan, Doug Ford drawing more heat this week on Wednesday for comments. He said that he treats First Nations like gold, but they keep coming hat in hand. He has just a little while ago apologized for that, but your thoughts on what he had to say?
Well, if there's anything Doug Ford is blunt and honest, and in many ways I think we should be thankful that he shows what he really thinks, and if somebody shows you who they are, then believe them. And the thing about Doug Ford is that I think he's a prototypical Canadian. He's a person who in many ways kind of reflects the working person, and I think many Canadians do like that. The problem is it's just inherently wrong. It's not true at all that First Nations come with their hat in hand. What First Nations come is with a handshake in hand, trying to build a relationship with forces that ostracize, marginalize, keep people out of rooms, make plans on First Nations lands without including the First Nations themselves. We only have to see the Ring of Fire to see that there is a dysfunctional system of relationships in Ontario that have been going on over 3 decades. And when 15 First Nations, only one of those 15 come to the table and have any sort of agreement this project can go forward, it tells you that it is not First Nations that are the problem. Is it going to be the other 14, or is it the singular common denominator, which is the province of Ontario government, with a head that says completely inappropriate, inaccurate, and divisive statements? I think it's pretty obvious who the problem is here when it comes to just simple resource projects in Ontario, like the Ring of Fire, and it's not First Nations.
Jennifer, did you want to weigh in on what Doug Ford had to say and his pretty quick apology?
I think that this is just a prime example of what we get to deal with in any form of government. I echo Niigaan on the fact that I'll give him the fact that he's extremely blunt. I would rather somebody just be mean and rude than somebody that pretends to be nice and then does mean and rude things behind our backs. And I think this really highlights how complex it is. We have the federal government trying to ram through legislation right now and just bulldoze over our rights, and they don't care, obviously. And then we have a provincial premier of Ontario saying out loud that we just like handouts and we always have our hat out, and he's tired of dealing with us. And it's like, at some point, I think we all need to recognize that there is not an easy way to deal with government, but we need to stop treating some of these politicians as better options than other ones when we're just getting the crap end of the stick, essentially, from all of them. But what's frustrating is that we're also seeing some of the bigger voices in the space, and even people that have been, historically against, conservative politicians and the Conservative Party of Canada because of the Harper era legislation. that now we're seeing a Carney government essentially mirroring some of Harper's tactics. And it's like, hey guys, we actually need you to come in and speak to this too, because this is just as bad. And now is not the time for the partisanship, because we actually need you on side all of the time. But we get those partisans that stay within their camps. So we'll have conservatives in Ontario that are pumping Doug Ford's tires, and then we have liberals that are going to be pumping Mark Carney's tires. And it's like, well, who's left to be allies with us in a time like this? So.
Nigan, the flip side of these bills was presented to the AFN at a virtual forum on Monday when the First Nations Major Project Coalition, who represents 180 First Nations, said, done right, this all could be a historic shift in how Indigenous peoples are included in the economy. Thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, let's be clear. There's First Nations. We're talking about over 640 First Nations. There's going to be varied opinions on Bill 5, C-5, and there's going to be lots of different ways that First Nations see this as an opportunity. This is not something that is not without merit. There are many First Nations that see tons of possibilities of getting projects. There is some ownership. Dozens of First Nations own portions of pipelines and resource projects out in British Columbia and Alberta. And so there are First Nations that see possibilities and interests within these growing bills. I guess the other challenge is that for those that are thinking First Nations are a monolith when it comes to the energy or energy extraction projects, it's never going to be that way. I don't care if it's 100 years ago or 100 years from now. There's always going to be varied opinions on this. And then on top of that, I think that there is some areas of opportunities. I'll be a little optimistic for a moment. If I was the Carney government, what I would do is I would emphasize specifically those projects in the national interest and put those in where is the most amicable areas in which First Nations are clearly on board, advocating for those projects, and then try to find some footholds there and some successes. If you find, success breeds success, and if you're worried perhaps of some resistance in areas that I would work with those First Nations who want to work with you and who want to build those projects quickly. You may be able to get some success stories, and then you also may be able to get First Nations who maybe have some historical mistrust and are certainly concerned and legitimately concerned because of exploitation in the past, and include them on a much more earlier style in which you're going to make them a lot of mistakes, but you're also going to have a lot of teachings and learnings from dealing with those projects that are successfully put through. And that may be just the process of reconciliation. It takes time. It takes a lot of listening. It also makes learning from your mistakes. And I think that this bill optimistically might give us an opportunity in order to do that, but in only small corners of the country.
Wanted to talk a bit about National Indigenous Peoples Day, of course, this Saturday. Jennifer, your thoughts on the importance of the day?
I think it's an important day to bring everybody together, very similar to Truth and Reconciliation Day. That is one of those days where I hope people get out in community and partake in whatever activities your local community has to offer. And every year I remind people, don't be scared to get involved. It's the best time to come out. Pretty much every community typically has something going on. I know my city does, and it's always very welcoming environments. And, just bring your sense of humor, because we're people that like to laugh. And if we pick on you, that means we like you. So get out to events and participate and make connections too. If you've always wanted to attend a powwow or, just get involved in some way and you want to be an ally and you're like, where do I start? Make those connections while you go to events too. Don't be shy to get to know people. And I know there's always people that love to share, stories or whatever it might be. So chat with people while you're out and don't be scared to get involved and take in what the day means.
Yes, definitely. If you see Jennifer, go up and chat with her. She says she's really funny. Nigan, your reflections on this coming National Indigenous Peoples Day during National Indigenous History Month?
At the end of almost every talk I give or visit to a church or to a boardroom or to a classroom, the number one question is, what can I do to forward reconciliation? What can I do to begin to address historical harm or genocide? Or what can I do to be able to change the trajectory of Canada? And here it is, everybody. This is the day. This is the moment. There are two critical days, I think, when it comes to reconciliation, and there's many more actually. We can, Red Dress Day comes to mind as maybe a third, but National Indigenous Peoples Day, June 21st, the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, September 30th. These are two critically important days in which Canadians can take it upon themselves to wear something different, talk to people that are different, engage in processes that might be a little different than what you're used to. And all of that is in the interest of building the country. This is exactly what national events, national days, holidays are supposed to be about. It's not supposed to be about taking the day off and just cutting your grass. It's about stepping up as a Canadian and saying, what does it mean to be Canadian? And just like we would never tell anyone on Remembrance Day to stay home and don't think of the incredible sacrifices of veterans, on National Indigenous Peoples Day, the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, and all other days that are calling to action change, people are invited to do things. And it doesn't always have to be something aggressive, something that you're quite, maybe not ready for. I'm like a very serious formal ceremony. Maybe it's about looking things up on the internet. It's about reading a book for the first time. It's also about, as Jen pointed out, going to a powwow, which is probably the most fun event anyone could ever go to from any place. It is a place where you're going to get a lot of great food. You're going to meet a lot of great people, and everybody's celebrating. There's nothing about it that's sad, other than maybe a memorial, a recognition of somebody who's maybe passed on, or a recognition of the things that have happened in the country. But it is always about dance, song, community, and that's what most Indigenous events are about.
Lots going on this Saturday here in Winnipeg to check out, that's for sure. Jennifer Negon, we'll leave it there, but happy National Indigenous Peoples Day to you both.
Yeah, me thanks.